Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. You know, the death of Colonel John Singleton Mosby at age 83 in 1916 made headlines in newspapers across the United States. Celebrated throughout the South for his service as a leader of the 43rd Battalion Virginia Cavalry, better known as Mosby's Rangers. He became a Republican after the war and a good friend of his former foe, Lieutenant General and President Ulysses S. Grant, serving a stint as U.S. Consul to Hong Kong. One of the newspapers who recounted the details of Mosby's life and service was the Evening Sun of Baltimore, which was decidedly pro secessionist at the beginning of the late war. The Sun published a biographical sketch by James William Foster of Virginia's Fauquier County. He served as a captain of Company A in Mosby's command. I want to share excerpts from Foster's account, which provided Americans of the early part of the 20th century a view of Mosby as a man of character, a man of determination who had been loyal to Virginia, to the South, and then to the post Civil War United States and Grant. Foster writes, at the early age of 13, Mosby entered the University of Virginia and was progressing well with his studies there when an unfortunate altercation with a citizen of the county resulted in the shooting of his antagonist. He not only justified this action, but was proud of the fact that he had fired his first shot in defense of womanhood. The man in question had spoken disparagingly of a young woman whom Mosby did not know. The ungallant action of the victim angered the chivalrous Mosby, and he immediately defended her, declaring that no lady's name should be taken in vain. Judge Robinson, who passed the sentence, had the greatest admiration for Mosby, and in afterlife, the soldier was a frequent guest at the jurist's home. Mosby received a sentence of fine and imprisonment for this offense, which seriously interrupted his collegiate course. The injustice of the punishment is evidenced by the fact that the next session of the legislature, immediately upon assembling, took the matter up at the suggestion of the governor and promptly annulled the verdict, accepting, of course, the imprisonment that had already been executed. It was during this incarceration in the Charlottesville jail that Mosby began the study of law under the direction of William J. Robertson, then the Commonwealth's attorney who, while being compelled by virtue of his official position to prosecute the young student, had declared it the most disagreeable duty of his life. In the spring of 1861, when the telegraph flashed over the excited country the news that President Lincoln had issued his famous call upon Virginia for her quota of 75,000 troops, John Singleton Mosby was in attendance upon Washington County Court at Abingdon, Virginia. It was during a recess in the term of the court that the intelligence was received, and Mosby, walking past the telegraph office, became aware that something of more than usual interest was transpiring. Going into the office, he obtained a copy of the dispatch. Realizing the importance of the tremendous tidings to the people of the state, he went at once with the momentous news to Honorable John B. Floyd, who was then at his home in Abingdon. You students of the Civil War, well familiar with John B. Floyd. The latter immediately issued a call to arms, which reverberated throughout the length and breadth of the Old Dominion, with a result that is now history. Of course, that history is secession. With a promptness and determination in action, always one of his most strongly marked characteristics, Mosby enlisted at once for the defense of his native state in the inevitable struggle. In anticipation of stirring events, military companies had been raised all over the state, and one of these, the Washington Mounted Rifles, then forming at Abingdon, was joined by Mosby. It was commanded by Captain, later General William E. Jones, a West Pointer, between whom and Mosby a warm friendship there began. The year 1861 was one of action, and events succeeded each other rapidly. But a few days elapsed after Mosby's enlistment until his company was ordered to Richmond. This march of several hundred miles on horseback gave the young recruit his first taste of the rough side of a soldier's life, and it was characteristic of the man that he was one of the very few who uttered no complaint. After a rest of 2 or 3 days in Richmond, the company was ordered to the Valley of Virginia, being assigned to the 1st Virginia Cavalry, commanded by Colonel Jeb Stuart. Joining their regiment at Bunker Hill, near Winchester, Virginia, the next few weeks were occupied in drilling, picket duty, and the routine of camp life, interspersed with an occasional uneventful reconnaissance. Then the regiment was ordered to Manassas, where it arrived in time to participate in the first Bull Run battle. The value and proper use of cavalry had not at that time been figured out in the circumlocution office, and therefore the splendid opportunities offered in this fight were not utilized. In February 1862, Stuart had been made a brigadier general and Jones a colonel, and the latter immediately called upon Mosby and made him adjutant of the regiment, for he was then and had continued ever since to be a very efficient man. He used to say years later that he was never so much frightened in a fight he afterward got into as he was in conducting his first dress parade as adjutant. His difficulties on this score did not last long, however. In the reorganization of the Army a few months later, Fitz Lee was elected colonel of the 1st Virginia Regiment instead of Jones and put in a friend of his own as adjutant, relegating Mosby to the ranks again. Thus, we find him at the close of the first year's service just where he started, a private. While serving under Stuart all this time, Mosby had never had any personal acquaintance with him until about the time he was made adjutant in February 1862, and then it was only a casual meeting. He was, therefore, as much surprised as pleased when, as the army retired from Manassas in the spring of 1862, Stuart, who was in command of the rear, sent for him to act as scout. In this capacity, he was directly under Stuart's eye, and the great cavalry general soon learned to appreciate the zeal, the courage, the keen military sagacity, quick perception, and promptness of action of the man he later came to admire so greatly. During the ensuing months were enacted so many daring deeds and brilliant achievements, of which Mosby was the central figure, that the scope of this sketch forbids their recital. Among them were adventures within the enemy's lines, in uniform, of course, in search of information which he always brought back, if possible, to be obtained. On one occasion, he was sent to get some knowledge of the enemy's movements that was of especial importance, and falling into the hands of patrol, was captured and carried to headquarters. Knowing a cartel had just been arranged for a quick exchange of prisoners, he kept his ears and eyes open as he was quickly shifted from place to place, and when he was exchanged and returned to Stuart's headquarters, he carried with him full information on the subject wanted, and not very much behind the time his commander had expected him to be gone. When McClellan was quartered at Richmond, Stuart sent Mosby, at his own request, to reconnoiter the enemy and get certain information. So successful was Mosby that Stuart made a raid around the forces of the Union Army, something which was never done before in the history of the war. As he was resuming his march back to camp, Mosby asked to be allowed to remain behind with a few men just for a day or two. Stuart readily assented, and this was the beginning of Mosby's career as a partisan ranger. In his war reminiscences, Mosby says, I got 9 men, including, of course, Fountain Beatty, who volunteered to go with me. This was the beginning of my career as a partisan. The work I accomplished in 2 or 3 days with this squad induced him to let me have a larger force to try my fortune. I took men down in Fairfax and, in 2 days, captured 20 cavalrymen with their horses, arms, and equipment. The next day, I started back to rejoin Stuart, who was near Fredericksburg. I found him in his tent, and when I told him what I had done, he expressed great delight. So he let me go back with 15 men and try my luck again. I went and never returned. I was not allowed to keep my men long. Fitzley complained of his men being with me, and so I had to send them back to him. But while I had them, I kept things lively and humming. I made many raids on the cavalry outpost, capturing men, arms, and horses. Old men and boys joined my band. Some had run of the gauntlet of Yankee pickets, and others had swum the Potomac to get to me. Upon this beginning was founded the career of one of the greatest leaders of partisan warfare the world has ever produced. 4 regular formal histories, each covering 400 to 600 octavo pages, besides numbers of sketches, have been published recording Mosby's achievements. And yet, a tithe of them have not been told. From them, however, his methods and much of the work done by him have been learned. But his objects and his aims have never been fully and fairly understood, even by but few of our own people. It is generally considered that he fought his command just as most other men were fought, for the purpose of killing and capturing as many as possible of the enemy in sight. But this was by far the least part of Mosby's aim. His plan was by making it hot for the enemy's rear to withdraw and keep as many as possible away from the front. Let him speak for himself. Mosby stated, my purpose was to weaken the armies invading Virginia by harassing the rear. As a line is only as strong as its weakest point, it was necessary for it to be stronger than I was at every point in order to resist my attacks. It is easy, therefore, to see the great results that may be accomplished by a small body of cavalry moving rapidly from point to point on the communications of an army. To destroy supply trains, to break up the means of conveying intelligence, and thus isolating an army from its base, as well as its different corps from each other, to confuse their plans by capturing dispatches, are the objects of partisan war. It is just as legitimate to fight an enemy in the rear as in the front. Now, to prevent all these things from being done, heavy detachments must be made to guard against them. The military value of a partisan's work is not measured by the amount of property destroyed or the number of men killed or captured, but by the number he keeps watching. Every soldier withdrawn from the front to guard the rear of an army is so much taken from its fighting strength. I endeavored, as far as I was able, to diminish the aggressive power of the Army of the Potomac by compelling it to keep a large force on the defensive. I assailed its rear, for there was its most vulnerable point. My men had no camps. If they had gone into camp, they would soon have all been captured. They would scatter for safety and gather at my call like the children of the mist. A blow would be struck at a weak or unguarded point, and then a quick retreat. Many expeditions were undertaken and traps laid to capture us, but all failed, and my command continued to grow and flourish until the final scene at Appomattox. At the time of the surrender, his command numbered nearly 700 men, officially known as the 43rd Battalion of Virginia Cavalry, and was just as legitimately a part of the regular constituted Army of Northern Virginia as any regiment in it. The only difference being that they were on detached service and operated under partisan ranger laws, which allowed the men engaged in a fight to acquire and keep as their own all property captured by them. And just here it is due to Colonel Mosby to correct another error that has obtained considerable circulation, to wit, that plunder was a great motive in all his expeditions, that there were men in the great conglomeration of which the command was composed who were so actuated, none will deny. But there was no considerable number of such, and as far as Mosby himself was concerned, he could never be prevailed upon to accept the slightest article. He would not allow the men to give him one of the captured horses, even to replace his own, which had been killed. And from the division of spoils, he always required that the men should accept beef cattle and mule teams, which were sent back to the army in the field. When Mosby had disbanded his command at Salem, when his surrender had been refused upon the terms agreed upon between Lee and Grant, he rode to this lady's house a few miles away. While there, some 15 or 20 men following stopped to see him. Before leaving, they gathered around him and, baring their heads, dropped on their knees, begging him with streaming eyes to take them with him and defy the whole Union army, swearing their allegiance to him till death and offering to follow him to the ends of the earth. But after Lee's surrender, Mosby selected 35 of his men, among whom was Dr. J.G. Wiltshire of Baltimore, and they went to Richmond to see if Johnston had surrendered. 2 months later, they surrendered only after they had received official orders to surrender from the headquarters of the Confederate Army. Many a time, said Dr. Wiltshire, who was a bosom friend of Colonel Mosby's, have I heard him say, as he led his troops into action, that he loved old Virginia better than his life. I have seen Mosby in every phase of action, and nothing pleased me more than one day when he refused a portion of $5,000 out of $184,000, which had been captured by his troops. The men were positive that he should accept, but he told them, "Keep it for yourselves, boys. I don't want any of it." And his hold upon the citizen people among whom he operated was not less conspicuous. There was not even the form of civil authority maintained in the counties of Loudoun and Fauquier, and the people, with common consent, brought all their troubles and grievances to Mosby for adjustment. He decided all their cases for them with justice and impartiality, and both parties invariably accepted his verdict as final. He was a welcome and honored guest at every house, though everyone knew the anger generated in the hearts of his enemies by harboring him, and the best of everything was set before him. His only stimulant was coffee, and families throughout Mosby's Confederacy would drink rye coffee or other substitute for weeks, saving the little roasting of Yankee coffee for the colonel. There can be no better illustration of the results of Phil Sheridan's effort to make the people hate the very name of Mosby by undertaking to burn him out than the attendance at a Mosby reunion held at Marshall, Fauquier County in 1895, when there flocked to the meeting place to do him honor to him by their presence those people whose barns and houses Sheridan had burned for Mosby's sake, the largest assemblage of citizens ever brought together in the county of Fauquier on any occasion. And this in spite of the fact that since the war, these same people have not been in political affiliation with Mosby. When Hancock, Winfield Scott, backed by the War Department, refused to accept Mosby's surrender as an officer of the Army of Northern Virginia, General Grant came to the rescue and had it so settled. From this originated an acquaintance that ripened into a close friendship between Grant and Mosby, which lasted until Grant's death. It was not remarkable, therefore, that when he was called on to choose between Grant and Greeley, that he should prefer his friend, the soldier, who had fought for his principles and had stood for the rights of Mosby, when it was, to say the least, very unpopular to do so. There are very many people who severely criticized Mosby's action then, who now think it would have been better for the South if we had all chosen as he did. The reason for the bond of friendship, which amounted really to affection between General U.S. Grant and Colonel Mosby, is known by few. Grant's care of Mosby was inexplicable to those who followed Grant and were not conversant with the real facts. It seems that when Lee surrendered at Appomattox, Grant, in his magnanimity, allowed Mosby and his band of guerrillas to be included in the order of surrender, and they were to be accorded the same treatment as Lee's regular force. To this, Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton vigorously objected and issued an order that Mosby was to be hanged when caught. But Grant had given his word as a soldier that all who were in the Confederate Army should be equally treated. This little episode was the means of widening the breach between the general commanding the victorious veterans and the impetuous Stanton. Grant was never known to surrender, and in this case, it was the doughty Secretary of War who was forced to capitulate. In the Grand Campaign of 1872, Virginia, having been reconstructed, voted for president for the first time since the war. Republicans were not as plentiful in Virginia then as now, and Mosby had always been a Democrat. It was hard for the administration party to make a showing. Mosby, never forgetting Grant's kindness to him in standing manfully by him when his head was in danger, jumped into the breach and stumped the state for him. Immediately, Mosby the idol became Mosby the outcast. He was forsaken by his friends, his law practice dwindled, and he was ostracized from the soil of Virginia for the political stand he took in that campaign. Grant was never known to forget his friends, and the last public act of his career was communication to the incoming President Hayes that Colonel Mosby be appointed to represent this country in China. In many other ways, Grant befriended Mosby. Under Mr. Hayes's administration, Colonel Mosby accepted the appointment as consul to Hong Kong, China, which he held for a long term of years, resigning during Mr. Cleveland's first term. Returning to America, the colonel settled in San Francisco, where he conducted a practice of law for many years. Shortly before the outbreak of the war, Colonel Mosby married Miss Pauline Clark, of a prominent family of Kentucky who died several years ago. Two sons survive him, Messrs. John Mosby of Washington and Beverly Mosby, a lawyer in the state of Washington. Three daughters also remain, Mrs. Stewart Coleman of Washington and Mrs. Pauline and Ada Mosby, who live in Baltimore. A brother, William Mosby, died several years ago. During the war, he was an adjutant in his brother's regiment. The colonel was devoted to his family, and nothing pleased him more than to have them around him while he recited some of the daring deeds and adventures in which he had been the central figure. So there you have the biography, a biographical sketch by J.W. Foster, one of the captains who served in Mosby's command, the well-known 43rd Battalion Virginia Cavalry, Mosby's Rangers. This published the day after his death in 1916 at age 83. Thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.